Hi, my name is Brent, and I'm a member of Houston's chapter of Extinction Rebellion. Thanks for joining for the talk, Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. In this talk, we'll talk about the scale of the problem, our approach to addressing the problem, and how you can get involved. And throughout this talk, you'll see this thermometer, and it's showing departure from normal, normal being defined as the average temperature from 1880 to 1920. And we'll look at how far from that we are moving and how far we may move in the future if we keep our current trajectory. We've all heard these, right? If each of us does our part, we can avoid a bad outcome. If we each pick up our litter, if we each recycle, if we each reduce our carbon footprint. The problem is that the scope and scale of this problem is beyond what we can address with individual efforts. Yes, we must each do our part, but each of us doing our part isn't enough. Look at what we're up against. On this list of the top 100 CO2 emitters in the world are some of the largest businesses that the planet has ever seen, and the most profitable businesses in the history of profit. On this list, and it's mostly made up of fossil fuel companies, some of which are national fossil fuels companies, so there are geopolitical angles to this. But I want to draw your attention to number 5, ExxonMobil on this list. Because in 1977, the scientists at ExxonMobil started wondering, could we be adding enough CO2 to the atmosphere to be affecting our environment? And they thought that surely the business would have to change if that were the case. And they studied it. They happened to have these big ships, and they were able to take measurements of the water, looking at how acidic it was becoming, take measurement of the air far from sources of pollution, and they determined that yes, in fact, we were changing our environment in fundamental ways. A few years later, in 1982, Exxon scientists started looking at how much of change are we creating. And they made some predictions then. In 1982, they predicted that by 2020, we would have 415 parts per million of atmospheric carbon, and the global temperature would have risen by 1 degree Celsius. And in fact, that's where we are. On the nose, Exxon, good job. But did they change their business model? No. In fact, they started investing hundreds of millions of dollars over the years in climate denial. And they're not alone. Many of the other companies on this list did the same thing, have the same knowledge, and refused to share it with the world. So that today, half of all of our CO2 emissions have been since we've known better. We've known that we're turning our world into an oven, and we've carried on. And why do we do this? We have good science. We have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but there's a few things about the way it operates. One is it operates on a consensus model, which in general is very, very good. It also tends to produce more conservative statements, having to get everyone to sign up. And so what they say ends up being what everyone can agree on. And one of the outcomes of this has been that observed reality is worse than the predictions they made. I'll go through some examples with you. So here are some projections around Arctic sea ice and the observations in red. It's getting worse faster than predicted. In fact, it's getting worse at a pace, and we were already at a state where it was worse than anybody could conceive of in the 90s. Here are a number of articles, a lot of these are from the Scientific American, the same thing, showing that we are getting hotter faster, less ice faster, that things are getting worse faster than predicted. This level of surface melt in Greenland wasn't predicted until 2070. We had it in 2019. Another example, sea level rise versus predictions. We're at the high end of the predictions and exceeding them in some cases. Now, part of this is due because the IPCC, while it understood that there are feedback loops, due to their consensus model, they couldn't agree on exactly how to model the feedback loops, and so they simply left them out. But these feedback loops are substantive, and some of them are difficult to understand, but this one's not. As the temperature rises, the Arctic sea ice melts. Arctic ice is brilliantly white, and it reflects energy back into space. When it melts, darker ocean water absorbs the heat that would have been reflected, leading to more temperature rise, leading to more Arctic sea ice melting, and so on. It's a negative spiral. It's a feedback loop. And as I said, it's not insubstantial. The warming since 1978 is equal to 25% of the warming from the emissions themselves. So these feedback loops have a real impact on the changes that we see. And that one's not the only one. Here's another one, permafrost melt. Locked away in the permafrost, which is in the Arctic Circle, is a huge amount of carbon. To date, humans have emitted about 430 billion metric tons of carbon. And stored in that permafrost is about another 3 times more carbon than what we've already released. So what can we expect as the permafrost melts? Well, estimates vary, but they vary from between a significant fraction of what we've already released and a multiple of what we've already released. Another feedback loop is Amazon deforestation. We often think of the Amazon as the lungs of the earth, as a big carbon sink, a place where carbon gets stored away. But in fact, as we have deforested the Amazon is, over the past few years, a net emitter of CO2. It's no longer a carbon sink. It emits more carbon than it sucks up. And scientists tell us that to be the lungs of the earth, there's kind of a minimum viable size to the rainforest. And that if we lose another 20% of the rainforest ecosystem itself could collapse. There's a paper written in 2018, Trajectories of the Earth System in the Anthropocene, and it looks at these feedback loops and the temperature at which they can start to kick in. And this paper concluded that we're headed for about 5 degrees of warming by 2100. 5 degrees. Well, let's start to look at what some of these increases might mean to us. So today, we're already at 1 degree. And what do we see with 1 degree? Well, we see more deadly storms. Here in Houston, we've seen 3 500-year floods in 3 years. And I always ask people to hold up their hands when I do these live and ask how many of us lived through all of these and how many of us are over 1,500 years old, right? One of the things about moving a system out of stability is that it doesn't go to a new stable, it goes to chaotic. And so while some areas get wetter, it tends to be the wet areas get wetter, the dry areas get drier. And so at the same time that we have increasingly deadly storms and floods, we also see water shortages. And here are people in India lining up for water. Another thing that we've seen, and this strikes close to home in Texas, is that most of the undocumented immigrants coming across our southern border are from Guatemala. In Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have experienced a brutal drought. And so we see Mr. Lopez saying, you know, it's the worst drought they've ever had. You know, he may be forced to migrate. They can't go on like this. And so this past summer, we saw 300,000 people head north from that part of Central America to the United States. And did we meet them with respect for their plight? Did we meet them with help? We did not. We met them with a wall, we met them with tear gas, and we met them with a president who asked if it was okay to shoot them. That's what we did at 1 degree of global warming. We asked if it was okay to shoot people. Because what happens when an ecosystem starts to fall under stress is that you have scarcity. And scarcity can lead to collapse of societies. That scarcity breeds conflict between one person and another, between one nation and another. You've probably heard our president say, make America great again and America first. We also see the scarcity conflict leads to totalitarianism and authoritarianism and fascist forms of government. And as we look around ourselves, we can see most, if not all, of these warning signs of fascism. The light is blinking red. That's at 1 degree. What happens at 2? Well, at 2 degrees, we continue to have severe storms. These storms will wash over islands, but worse than that, at this level, island nations in the Pacific start to go underwater. Nations disappear due to sea level rise. And crop yields fall by 7%. Now, how many people think that everyone on the face of the planet goes to bed with a full belly every night? They do not. We already have people who die of starvation and are malnourished. And if crop yields fall by another 7%, that impacts that. We have more starving, more malnourished people, which is scarcity. And scarcity leads to conflict. So that hothouse earth paper, let's kind of go back and look at this and some of these tipping points, because we just talked about 1 degree and 2 degrees. And if we look at this chart, it shows that the items in yellow are things that happen in that temperature range between 1 degree and 3 degrees. The Greenland ice sheet, Arctic summer ice, alpine glaciers, and it's not just alpine glaciers, right? The Indian subcontinent has 900 million people who rely on the spring meltwaters of Himalayan glaciers for their water, for their drinking water, for their crops, for every use of water. We saw what happened in Texas when 300,000 of our neighbors came knocking. What happens when 900 million people go on the move? And it's not just that. As we look at these things that are supposed to happen at 3 degrees, what's also interesting is that some of the things that aren't supposed to happen until 3 to 5 degrees are actually starting to happen. The thermohaline circulation mentioned on this chart, well, that's the Gulf Stream. Well, the Gulf Stream is one of the best known examples of thermohaline circulation. It helps moderate the climate, and it is in fact slowing down and could break down entirely. And we're only at 1 degree. The thing is that we don't know exactly when these tipping points happen, and some of these tipping points can trigger runaway warming. And even without those, we're on a trajectory for 5 degrees. So what about 4? Let's take a look at 4. That's on our way to 5. So the impacts of 4 degrees, first of all, crop yields fall by 60%. Most of the food that the planet relies upon can no longer be produced. And even first world cities start to go underwater. When crop yields fall by 60% and cities go underwater, we will see massive numbers of climate deaths and massive displacement. And those two things, the deaths and displacement, lead to even more scarcity, lead to even more conflict. There's people who study this. Our friend Kevin here looks at exactly these types of problems. And he and his cohort have developed the widespread view that 4 degrees is incompatible with an organized global community. You know, another way of saying organized global community is civilization. 4 degrees of warming is incompatible with civilization as we know it. In 2017, this paper came out, Turn Down the Heat, and it talks about exactly what Kevin voiced, that we don't think that we can adapt to a 4-degree hotter world. And it has to be avoided. We can't go there. And in 2017, they said only early cooperative international actions can make that happen. It's 2020. Where are the early cooperative international actions? In the US, we have dropped out of the Paris Accords. The EPA has been disabled. Massive tranches of regulations have been repealed. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. We are going the wrong way. Xu and Ramanathan also study this, and they say we've got to stay well below 2. And they have a paper that points out mitigation strategies for staying below, because this is their categorization. 1.5 is dangerous, 3 is catastrophic, and greater than 5 it's an uncharted world. We don't know what that world even looks like. But Kevin tells us that civilization isn't possible there. Xu and Ramanathan also point out that there's already a 1 in 20 chance, 5%, that the carbon already in the atmosphere could cause human extinction. And there I've said the second word. I like to say we are Extinction Rebellion for a reason, right? So here is the word extinction. We are in a 6th mass extinction. There have been 5 previously. 4 of those were highly correlated with carbon. These are events where nearly all life gets destroyed. And today, 1 in 4 species are at risk of extinction. You can see here very high percentages of a wide variety of plants and animals are at risk of extinction. And we are not separate from our environment. We are part of the environment. We rely on the broader ecosystem. And so the 6th mass extinction could be our extinction as well. So Brent, take a breath. Governments are acting, aren't they? Well, we have the Paris Peace Accords. Many nations are still involved in them, and lots of city and state governments in the United States are adhering to them. So, you know, we ought to be okay. We're at 1. We're below even the 1.5 danger level that Xu and Ramanathan pointed out, right? So, in the Paris Agreement, even if the United States federal government doesn't go along, the other countries in the world and cities and states, we're going to be fine. Well, the thing is that government's promises don't meet the demands of the Paris Agreements. In fact, if we go down the path of the government's current promises, we're going to blow past the 1.5 number, probably roughly doubling that number. And I don't know about you, but one of the things I've noticed about governments is that even what they promise is often more than they end up delivering. And so if you look at the actual policies that have been implemented, they have a solidly passed Xu and Ramanathan's catastrophic levels. Governments aren't acting. So I've put out some pretty heavy information there. The world as we know it is already gone at 1 degree of warming. It's going to get worse. So I think there's a need for both emotional and practical responses, and it's a call to ask how we want to live our lives. And so I'd invite you to take a moment, mourn that the world that you knew is gone. Think about what the world will look like if civilization breaks down. More importantly, though, think about the world you would like to see. A world of greater cooperation, a world where we care for our neighbors even if they're not next door, and a world where we blunt and turn around climate change. And if you can see that world, or even if you just want to see it, I ask you to take this challenge and this artwork from Banksy. And from this moment, despair ends and tactics begin. And to undertake the tactics, we need courage because the outcome is uncertain. That's what courage is. Courage is taking action when you don't know what will happen. Dr. Kate Marvel is from NASA's Goddard Institute, and she's often asked to speak on the topic of climate change. And she's often asked by the organizers, hey, let's make sure everybody understands how serious this is, but don't be a bummer. I mean, climate change, death and destruction, that can really bring people down. And Dr. Kate pushes back really hard that she does not have hope to give those people, that we need courage, not hope, that we are sending our children on a mission to a planet we don't recognize or understand. And that raises an ethical question for us all, doesn't it? What do we do when our government is actively leading us towards societal and ecological collapse and ensuring the deaths of billions of humans? We know this is where we're going. Unless despair ends, tactics begin, and we find and nurture courage. So I said the first word, extinction. Now let's talk about rebellion. People have thought about that question, what do we do when our government is leading us to ruin? John Locke was a conservative philosopher of the Enlightenment. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, liberal. Thomas Hobbes, conservative. Interestingly, though, they both said fundamentally the same things, that government's legitimacy comes from their ability to provide for their citizens a level of safety and security in which they can live their lives. And they said that any government that failed in that duty, the people were justified in changing that government. In fact, a couple hundred years ago in this country, some folks who listened to Locke and Hobbes wrote the Declaration of Independence. And they took some of the notions of Locke and Hobbes. And I'm going to read this. They said that to secure these rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. This is foundational to our country, foundational to what it means to be American, that we can and we should rebel against a government that actively is taking us towards destruction. The world that we know it is gone. This picture, I think, shows two possible future worlds. At the bottom is the destruction of greater than 5 degrees of global warming, the end of civilization as we know it, the death of billions of people, if not the death of all of us. There's another world where we preserve the great natural places and we reevaluate our relationship with the planet and also our relationships with one another. And this is why you'll often hear people in Extinction Rebellion talk about enrage and love. We're enraged over the outcome that is clear if we do nothing. And we think the way to change that is through love for the planet and love for one another. So we're going through a period of time right now where we have shown that we can change just about everything that we do quickly in order to address a problem that we grasp. We're flattening the curve of the COVID virus, and it's time that we act to flatten this curve too. We can do it, and there's a model for how to do it. When the United States got into World War II, we did not know in detail how that war would be won. But we knew that GM and Ford were no longer going to produce cars. They were going to produce material for the war effort. And those companies and thousands of other companies across the country, in a matter of months, changed from things that they had been building to what they needed to build. And today we know that we can't burn fossil fuels anymore. We don't have every piece of the puzzle. There's still some aspects to energy storage we have to figure out. We also have to figure out how to suck some of that carbon out of the atmosphere. But we know that we have to stop burning fossil fuels now. And we need system change, and we also need each of us to do our own part. And there will be sacrifices for some. We need to make sure that those sacrifices do not fall overly much on the shoulders of those who have borne so many of the burdens of the current system. We need a just transition, because 500 years from now, when we look from the point of view in this last picture, and by the way, recognize that the big change in the world that led to the end of World War II also fueled us to then go on to the moon. 500 years from today, when you look from this point in space, above the moon, looking back to the Earth, it's going to look pretty much the same. The only question is going to be, are we on that planet? Are we living with one another? And have we found a right balance in using the resources of our Mother Earth? So a lot of change is required. How does change happen? Did you vote? Good. You should. It's a bare requirement. Voting isn't enough, though. This is a map of Houston, shows the gerrymandered congressional districts that we have. These are not people picking their legislators. These are legislators defining their districts so that they pick their voters. And let's look at our two senators here in Texas. We have John Cornyn, gets a phenomenal amount of money from the securities and investment people and also the oil and gas people. We also have Ted Cruz, who is exactly the opposite. His number one donor group is oil and gas folks, and his number two is securities and investment. And don't think that he's a wimp on his fundraising. A lot of his went into his presidential campaign a couple of years ago. But the point is that these people aren't working for us. And the securities and investment industries are tightly intertwined with oil and gas. You may have noticed in December, Saudi Aramco held its IPO, and the shares popped like a tech company. The company is worth $1.8 trillion. What that means is that people are betting $1.8 trillion that they can burn all of that oil and gas and that they can kill us all and you can't stop them. That's the bet. So rebellion, not just any rebellion, nonviolent rebellion. Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephen wrote a seminal piece on exactly this, nonviolent rebellion. I recommend that everyone reads it. This is the way that Extinction Rebellion proposes that we move forward. We need to put pressure in the system by standing up and disrupting business as usual. We have a model for this too. Nonviolent civil disobedience in the days of the civil rights struggle. These people were not pushing specific legislative agendas. They were pushing the notion that people are created equal. They were demanding that all of us, black, brown, white, every shade of humanity, join together, because our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. The future of humanity matters. The way we treat one another matters. The way we treat the planet matters. We can't be silent. So what we're about is not about a specific legislative agenda, although most of us are big fans of the Green New Deal. No, like with the civil rights struggle, like with Gandhi, like with the labor movement, what we intend to do is change the acceptable dialogue to push what's called the Overton window. And the Overton window is that space in which policy dialogue happens, and it can move. In fact, the right wing has been very successful at pushing the Overton window over and having us talk about things that no one thought we would have ever talked about. But similarly, we've had successes on our side as well. You remember Occupy a few years ago started talking about income inequality and talked about the 1% versus the 99%. And underneath that radical movement came the Bernie campaign. And he talked about that wealth divide. He also talked about Medicare for all. He talked about many other policies. And today, we saw a recent primary campaign where every single candidate had to address those topics to be a credible candidate. We have pushed the Overton window and are now having a policy discussion in many facets that's on our terms. We need to continue that, and we need to grow those successes into the area of climate change. So, overview of Extinction Rebellion. Here in the US, we have 4 demands. And those demands are simply, first, we have to tell the truth. In most outlets, most stories, the truth and the whole truth is not being told. The dire situation that we are in is not explained to people. So we have to tell people the truth, and we have to start acting as if the truth is real. We have to have legally binding measures to reduce our carbon emissions to net zero by 2025. Now, some of you are saying, Brent, I thought it was 2030. Good catch. So what the reason for the difference is that if we get to net zero by 2030, we'll have a 70% chance of not exceeding the 2-degree climate change level. In order to have a 90% certainty of not exceeding it, we have to do it in 5 years. We also need to address the problems of our legislature and regulatory bodies being captured by the very industries they're supposed to regulate. We need a new democratic representative legislative system to oversee that transition. And hugely important, this cannot be something led by old white men such as myself. We have to prioritize climate justice, indigenous sovereignty, and reparations for the frontline communities who have been hurt by this the entire time this system has been in place. The principles of Extinction Rebellion, I'm just going to hit on a few. There are actually 9. I encourage you to check them out. But first is a strict commitment to nonviolent civil disobedience. Disrupt, yes, because you can't get the system to pay attention to you unless you disrupt. And an example of that, if you go in and ask for a raise, it's highly likely that the boss won't even look up from his desk. If you and all of your coworkers sit down on the job and say that you won't return to work until you get a raise, you may not get everything you want, but I guarantee you, you'll have a discussion and you may get a lot of what you want. So we're strictly committed to disruption through nonviolent civil disobedience. We have a huge commitment to respect and inclusion for all, and also a commitment to avoid hierarchical leadership. There is no president of Extinction Rebellion Houston. We all, I like to say, we are a leaderful organization. We're not leaderless, but we don't have a hierarchical structure either. And some folks who are familiar with Extinction Rebellion say, okay, Brent, so you're asking me to get arrested. Well, maybe. Right now in this time of the COVID virus pandemic, we are not blocking, but we do have today, and even when we are able to go out and be more disruptive physically, we have multiple groups. We have an outreach and media group. That's what's going on here, outreach to you. We also have groups that plan and execute actions. So yes, some of those will result in people being arrested. We also have groups that attend to our finances. And because we are in this for the long haul, we think it's important to take care of one another. And that's something that we want to bring to the future we're trying to build as well. And so we have working groups on regenerative culture. So why do we think this will work? Well, we look to what they did in the UK. The United States isn't the UK, but look at this. They wanted for the government to admit to and take action on the first demand, to tell the truth. They demanded the government declare a climate emergency, and they shut London down to get that. And it worked. They got climate emergency declarations. There's more to do. No one is coming to save us. For good or bad, we, you and me and the other people listening to this and hopefully joining us, we are the people we've been waiting for. I urge you to get in touch with us. We're on email, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can scan the patch there and it'll take you to a page that will sign you up, get on our mailing list. There's work to do. Let's get to it. I'm glad you're joining us. Thanks.